track came about through wanting to use a vocal sample from the Animatrix, which is an anime spin-off of The Matrix, one of my all-time favourite sci-fi movies. And this female narrator comes in with this really epic line, which is, "In the beginning there was man, then man made the machine." And yeah, I just imagine this really apocalyptic, quite dark track surrounding it. And yeah, so there's lots of interesting stuff going on in this track, and yeah, so let's get straight into it.
Then man made.
One of the key elements in this track, in addition to the vocal, is the synth ARP. That's one of the first things you hear in the intro, so I'll start with that. This is quite an interesting sound because there's quite a lot of modulation taking place over time, and I created this patch in Diva, which I love. We've got simple sawtooth, and we've got the cutoff, filter cutoff here with the UHB or UB sort of filter, kind of adding some nice sort of overdrive and saturation. And obviously it's in ARP mode, and where it gets a lot of its character is the glide between notes, and as the pattern evolves, I'm sort of automating the glide as well as the attack. You'll also notice that there's quite a lot of distortion on the sound, and as the track has that quite dark vibe, yeah, I really kind of went in a bit on the distortion on this sound. I really wanted it to sound like hot and angry. That's Decapitator there doing most of the heavy lifting. See, without it's quite thin. Especially when the cutoff opens. It's really got that like broken valve sound to it. And then in addition to that, we've got the Valhalla Vintage Verb. Bit of a mainstay. LFO tool, which is essentially that's doing the side chaining when it gets into the drop section. And yeah, you'll notice here it's kind of ducking on the kick and the snare. You'll also notice here on the timing, which is relates to the offset here. And the reason why I've inputted that value is because of the latency created by the plugins I have in the effects chain. So if I group all of these plugins here, and then hover my mouse over the leftmost side of the bar, you'll see that the latency is 78. So yeah, not actually 62, but there might have been something I introduced at a later point that gave it that value. But yeah, really important that if you're using an LFO tool at the end of an effects chain, then you're going to need to calculate the latency and input it into the offset to make sure everything is like bang on grid. Final thing I've got in the chain there is my underwater rack, which I use quite extensively. And in this case, I've turned the ARP into a pad sound in the intro. And it's a really good way of like introducing sounds. So they're coming from the background and gradually getting into focus, into the foreground. To me, like that ARP sound was everything. It felt like it was such a vibe. And yeah, it was like quite a cool, like fun techno sound to play with. Very bouncy, lots of movement. And yeah, it really makes sense like when it comes back in on the drop section, and we'll get to that part in a bit. So yeah, the rest of it is all kind of like, you know, adding to the soundscape. And this sound here, I've called that Wipeout ARP, and you know, being a big fan of like the original Wipeout games on the PlayStation, they had a very sort of like iconic soundtrack, which you know, back in the day was like Orbital and Chemical Brothers, and they used a lot of these like acid sounds. And I was playing around with yeah, this instrument here called TRK-01, and it's part of the Native Instruments Complete bundle, and I mean it's sort of like drum machine synthesizer hybrid, and you can get some really cool sounds out of it. And I think I was just like auditioning a bunch of different sounds and then sort of clipped out one that I liked and then sort of looped it and ended up with this running in the background just to kind of create a bit of movement. I've also got this techno pad here. Aside from that, in the intro, we've just got, you know, sounds that kind of fit into the techno sound palette. It's kind of like a stock sawtooth distorted thing I created. Here's a sample. Just add a bit of drama, a bit of atmosphere. Yeah, sort of like dubby thing. I find those dubby sounds work really nice with techno. And then as we head into the next 16, this is when things start to get a bit more interesting because I'm introducing this Reese. Which is a serum patch. And incidentally, it's exactly the same patch that I used underneath the vocal and Gravity. Just to quickly summarize, we've got a high-passed sine wave oscillating with 3 voices, detuned with the bend warp being modulated by LFO1. Give it some movement. And then where I've carved out the space here in the low end, I've replaced it with a kind of clean and more consistent subtone, just to sort of fill up the fundamental and keep it nice and consistent. Sort of sprinkled around, we've got like, again, I kind of wanted to have a very angry kind of quite sort of dissonant tone to a lot of the synth sounds in this, and the Prophet was like a natural choice to go for to get this sound here. You know, classic kind of melodic techno vibes. And again, I'd love to get that patch out for you guys, but I created it in the moment on the Prophet, and at that point I'd only just got the synth, so I hadn't worked out how to save the presets. Pretty easy to make though, I think. You know, you just got a couple of like detuned saws and a bit of distortion, a bit of overdrive. In addition to that, I've got this kind of like, I quite like the sound of this string sample, like very kind of vintage, almost housey string, really, you know, like Derek May-esque. And yeah, that's just a sample, but it had that kind of raw, like sounded like it was from a ROM or something. More like dramatic vibes heading into the build-up. So it's probably worth talking a little bit about the drums and percussion I've got happening in the intro. We've got hi-hat here, clap, nice short reverb on that. Again, we've got a vintage verb. Techno woodblock, I mean, I'll just expand this quickly. I mean, that is basically just a static woodblock with no groove by itself. If I take that off. But I often like to put the groove in by using LFO tool to control the volume of each individual hit. But yeah, really kind of quick way of doing stuff like that without having to edit individual audio clips. And then yeah, just some auto pan, give it a bit of spatial movement. Another hi-hat. Yeah, these are like kind of very typical techno samples, very sort of like underwater, kind of murky, like buried sort of vibes, which I really like. You know, hear them a lot of the music of Enrico Sanguilano and a lot of the drum code stuff. So that's kind of like where I was shooting for with this. Without the reverb. They're pretty fat by themselves, to be honest. I didn't have to do much work. And then we've got these mad shakers, which had quite quite an interesting story as far as shakers go. But yeah, essentially what we've got going on here, it's just a single note in MIDI. We've got LFO1 controlling the level of the white noise. And then we've got the LFO tool here sort of creating kind of step movement with the bandpass filter with a little bit of a push on the resonance. Kind of gives it like a melody almost. And then my idea behind this was to kind of try and create something that was as wide as super wide as possible. But obviously when you start introducing that kind of width, using like the dimension expander and the hyper sections of Serum, everything starts to sound a bit flammy and imprecise. So I then cleaned that up with LFO tool. So like a super tight curve here at 16. Yeah, and that's pretty much all there is to that. And then yeah, I was just like throwing in like loads of different like layers of stuff. And then I figured, well, I'll just sort of throw all that into an LFO tool as well and create like one big monster shaker. Just about very subtly here, like little hints of 909 in there and different bits of break, you know. So yeah, that is the shakers, and then yeah, just like a crunchy techno loop. I don't even know about this from. I think it might even be from my Rockwell remix from about 6 or 7 years ago. I think we all know that shaker. Cadence overheads, just probably taken from Addictive Drums and used in Cadence. Yeah, and those are like the breaks and all the kind of washy tops from We Got It. And yeah, just sort of like combining all of those together, and you know, I was kind of trying to get quite like a nice rugged groove, kind of techno-y groove. Brings a lot of vibe into the track, and kind of complements the kind of techno-y stuff going on.
Then man-made.
I started using a plugin called Lift FX because it's just purpose built for doing white noise and risers and downlifters and stuff like that, and you know, it's just really fit for purpose, very clean, very easy to use, and it's essentially just like a white noise generator, and I think maybe a sine wave generator and a couple of other bells and whistles. And so it's good because you can actually control a lot of the movement using. So it's really good to kind of like hone in and make your own kind of bespoke risers and stuff. Again, here's another one straight out of Lift FX. I think I messed around with it a bit. But yeah, I really like the kind of quite polished sounding white noise coming out of that. And yeah, heading into this section with our risers. Again, nice clean white noise. Sort of a frequency modulated sawtooth with loads of reverb on it. You can see how I've automated the fine tune and the frequency shifter there, just to kind of, you know, give it that gradual movement. And another riser coming out of Lift FX there. Clubby boom, you know, probably more at home in a electro track than a techno track, but this is drum and bass, so we can do whatever the hell we want. That rise is taken from a sound library called Rise and Hit by Native Instruments, something I've used extensively over the years, like really good for like cinematic stuff. Yeah, Ghost Voices Boom, that was like a low-end kick that I made on my Ghost Voices bootleg. And then white noise in the drop. So that's pretty much all the effects I'm using throughout the entire track. I mean, there's a couple of other little bits of ear candy towards the end, but yeah, that's essentially our kind of set of effects.
Then man-made.
As we kind of head into the build-up now, let's take a little look at the drums, and this is where I'm starting to bring in more sort of typical techno kind of drums too here with the 909 rock. Okay, so let's go through a few of the things that are going on here. So essentially the decay of the drum machine is opening, or the release, should I say. It's gradually opening as the pattern progresses. Yep, so you can see that here. And then in addition to that, we've got the reverb getting wetter and wetter, just to pull it into the background a bit, just as it's approaching a drop, and to create a bit of white noise from the snare. I've also got this great plugin by Dada Life called Endless Smile. The same guys who make Sausage Fattener, another brilliant plugin, but with equally amusing GUI. But yeah, this one essentially is just like a instant gratification riser generator. You can literally throw anything into it and pump the intensity and you'll get something pretty cool. Yeah, you can, try different. Yeah, and then Fab Filter Simplon. Just got it on the raw filter, which kind of adds a bit of harmonics and overdrive. The resonance is boosting the signals. It moves up the frequency spectrum. We've got another Simplon here, which is doing a low cut. So we're kind of pulling out some of those lows as we head up with a gentle, because I didn't want too much crazy resonances going on. Not a great deal else actually going on here, because after the first 8 bars, I pull out everything except for the kick, drum, build, 1 layer of shaker, and the snare roll. So we just kind of get a lot more intense. We start introducing the main sort of bass patch here, if you could call it out, like the horn. That's kind of very reverbed out, and it's like there in the background, just sounding quite menacing, and like you don't want to give all your aces away in the build-up, that's for sure. Like I'm saving this big moment, like the big horn, for the drop, because it's a bit of a crazy moment, and but you still want to kind of hint at it, otherwise it might feel a little bit sort of incongruous to the rest of the track. So yeah, literally we've got a high pass on that, and we're just sweeping it down, so the more frequencies are slowly but surely getting added to the sound as it approaches the drop.
Then man made.
I originally had the vocal sample directly from the film, but it was quite a messy sample. There was lots of Foley going on and different like background ambient sounds, so it was quite hard to get it to sit right and make it sound clean. So I actually got the sample recreated by a voice actor. If I play you the original sounds like this.
In the beginning, there was man. Then man made the machine.
There's all sorts of weird stuff going on there. And then this is the recreation. If I just turn off all of the effects here, because there's quite a lot of stuff that I did to this.
In the beginning, there was man. Then man made the machine.
So as you can hear, it's not quite right, and it doesn't have the same vibe as the original. So in order to sort of adapt it to make it sound more like the original, the first thing I did was to pull up Melodyne and to address the differences in intonation. Essentially, like the melody of her voice and like where she pitches it was quite different to how it was in the original, and I kind of wanted it to sound a bit more like the original. Let's have a quick look at that. So
in the beginning, there was man.
It also allowed me to correct some of the timing discrepancies. So essentially what I did, and this is quite a neat way of getting it bang on, is also putting a Melodyne on the reference track that you want to try and match. And then what will happen is when you load it up here, you'll have your sort of like the one you want to affect, and then the reference here, revocal and original. So I could even edit that if I wanted to, but I won't. So yeah, and then it's literally like a game of moving it all around and like matching the intonation, you know?
Hello, man.
I mean, you could do that, but then that sounded like a bit unnatural. So there were a few bits and pieces that I left alone. Things can quite quickly start to sound a bit robotic. That kind of resolved that issue. I kind of got the timing of it like almost bang on, really. So this is before.
Then man made the machine.
And this is after the Melodyne.
Then man made the machine.
So much more sort of like assertive and closer to what I liked about the original. And then yeah, just this gargantuan chain over here, which let's explode that a little bit because it's kind of fun. You know, I mean, often when you get like samples redone, you might become quite attached to the original, and it's like, oh god, I wish it could sound a little bit more like that. And you'd be amazed at how far you can go with using something like FabFilter Pro Key 3, putting it in match mode. And effectively what we can do here is like we can match the vocal with the original source. What you can see there in red
Then man made the machine
is the original signal, and then you can hit EQ match down here, take the, you know, you'd use the sidechain as the reference, external original, and then you literally can match the vocals sort of average EQ curve to the original. And yeah, I got it sounding pretty good doing that. You can add more nodes, and the more nodes you use, the closer it would sound. But you know, obviously it could sound a little bit comb filtered. But I actually did an experiment once where I took some white noise and matched it with like a vocal sound, just like one word, and you know, just use as many nodes as possible as I could with the EQ match in Pro Key 3, and drove the sort of wet all the way to the top, and it actually sounded like eerily similar. So yeah, it's very good at kind of mimicking sounds if that's what you're going for. And then yeah, so
Then man made the machine.
some pretty wild automation going on there. So there were bits that were sort of annoying me, you know, like sibilance isn't the fundamental of her voice is a bit inconsistent. And then here we've got this effects rack that I built to sort of like take care of this vocal a little bit better. And what we've got is Alter Boy. So
Then man made the machine.
because there's this like quite dark humanoid quality to the voice, where there's like a second voice. If you listen very closely to the original sample, there's like a second voice which is like maybe 2 semitones up, and it kind of actually it's 5 semitones up, and that kind of gives it that like robot voice.
Then man made the machine.
Alter Boy, great for that kind of stuff, and it also conveniently pans things very extremely left and right. Roll off some of the tops, roll off some of the bottom. And then, yeah, I've got more Foda here.
Then man made the machine.
Something I use a lot on my own vocals, you know, to give it that kind of like ethereal, like electric edge, you know, half man, half machine sort of aesthetic. And this again is similar to what I did with the Gravity voice, but this is kind of in that kind of whispered effect, just white noise modulator, pushing everything up before it goes into the vocoder, just to make sure you're getting like a consistent level and it's not just picking out certain syllables. I've then monoized it, rolled off some of the bottoms, and yeah, they just smashed it on the limiter. So this actually goes a long way to like giving it that feel that I wanted it to have.
Then man made the machine.
Then man made the machine. Then man made the machine.
Already it's sounding a little bit more futuristic, I guess. This is just like OTT just to push it, you know.
Then man made the machine.
Just to kind of like roll everything out, you know, try and get it as flat as possible.
Then man made.
So essentially the whole concept of this track is the interplay between the very fast, shuffly 16th note drums and other elements that kind of occupy that very staccato, kind of shuffly rhythm. And then like the very large sounding, sustained, distorted sawtooth. That sound, yeah, that is pretty fundamental to the whole track, I think. Yeah, so it's really dirty and kind of deliberately so. The original sound actually sounds a bit like this. And that came from, again, TRK, detuned sawtooth, and a descending low pass filter. You know, it's then a case of just really driving that sound and getting some kind of more character into it. Yeah, it really is trash, which is kind of driving it really. So we split this into 3 bands here, and from 1.5k downwards, essentially there's nothing going on. And then from 1.5 to 9k, we've got the distortion and clip control mode. And yeah, we're just driving that quite hard if we sort of solo that. And it's given that like really angry sort of presence that I was looking for, you know, around that sort of 3k area, kind of the 1.5 to 3k. And without it, it sounds a bit nice, you know. And then up in the top, 9k upwards, we've got even more distortion, because I quite like to sort of smudge out those tops. It's almost sounding like bit crushed in a way. So yeah, that's trash. And then we'll go into Simplon, which is doing a grand total of nothing at the moment. Yeah, boost on the tops. Reverb, which that starts to creep in a little bit later on in the patch. So essentially, I think I use that just to blur out the second part of the sound. So we've got a bit of overdrive on the sort of upper mids, 1k at a Q of 3. But yeah, not too much going on there actually, only like 9% on the dry wet. Try and help it sound a bit more angry. There's like a lot of like content going on in the sides there. So yeah, really I wanted to kind of tame a bit of that. So if we have a little listen to, we'll stick that in mid-side mode, have a listen to the sides. There's a lot of content there. So yeah, really I just sort of monoed the everything from 343 downwards. Super light, easy and useful tool, that one. Yep, and then again, yet another dramatic EQ. And this one here was quite crucial, because I realised it needed a lot of that kind of weight put back into it, you know, like around here. And it was well like... Yeah, in the final mix, I also boosted quite heavily here. I realised that the mix could take it, you know, and yeah, it benefited for sure. So at the end of the chain, I've got 2 instances of track spacer, and because this is quite a maximal sound, I needed to be quite delicate about how I sidechain that against the kick and the snare to get enough punch. Because using LFO tool, it was almost too much of an extreme cut, and you could hear it sort of audibly ducking a bit too much. So in this case, I used track spacer, which yeah, it's really one of my sort of holy grail plugins. So essentially how it works is it reads the frequencies of the source sidechain signal and then ducks that appropriately to what you're applying it to. It's a frequency dependent sidechain. Kick drum frequencies are being ducked from the horn. I can actually apply this filter here, so it only affects certain frequencies, just the top end or just the low end. I often find myself doing that in other cases, but here it made most sense to keep it full band. Does exactly the same thing, but to the snare. So yeah, it's ducking, but in the context of the mix, you can't really hear it too much. We dropped the track with this like big like horn of doom, and it felt kind of intuitive or logical to then do like a call and response thing by having something super kind of shuffly and sort of like staccato afterwards. So you kind of get that kind of question and answer tension release thing, which I achieved with this sound here, which is essentially the Animatrix vocal stretched. Yeah, just using Ableton's warp mode.
There was man. The beginning.
Yeah, so in the beginning, it's pitched down by 1 semitone, and what I've done is I've put it into, well, enabled warp mode, stuck it in tones mode, and just like time stretched it down to like nearly 1,000 BPM, which is like the maximum you can go to. And then what that's done is essentially granularized it. And it actually sounds a little bit like that scene in The Matrix with Morpheus when he takes the pill and he kind of makes his throat all metallic and stuff. Anyway, going back to that sound. So yeah, once I'd sort of like stretched it all out, create that quite digital sound, then went through, started putting some effects on it. So we'll go through those. And yeah, so again, like to create that groove, choppy. And that's coming from Telephoto on the 16th note. Took away a bit of the low end. Arvox, amazing for vocals and loads of other things. Valhalla Vintage, like a really nice tight room to exist in. And then gain reduction, just like a different OTT. You're just sort of doing more to the dynamics rather than the tone. Pro key 3, roll off the tops, roll off some of the lows, and then ducking to the kick and snare from Telephoto here. Another thing to point out, like sometimes you would want that ducking to be engaged and other times you might not. So say for example you had a sound that was like present in the breakdown, but then was also present in the drop, but on the drop you would then want to sort of sidechain that for ducking. You would want to switch off the Telephoto in the breakdown and you'd want to re-engage it in the drop. And what I've found is if you automate the on and off switch here, which would seem like the most obvious way of doing it, when that engages, you'll get a tiny bit of latency introduced into the project. And yeah, you don't want that, basically. It's quite an audible sort of pop or click. The way to negate that is by automating the depth here. So the way I do that these days is to just simply draw it in like this. So Telephoto disengaged, Telephoto engaged, depth 100. And then you can control the degree using the volume slider instead of the depth. After the second iteration of the horn, I wanted to bring in yet another stuttery sound. And here's kind of aptly named stutter bass. So let's have a little look at what's going on with this one. So the original sound started off as literally just a bounce version of the main horn. An automation here to do a descend on the pitch transposition. So it's bending downwards. We can go through the effects chain here. Okay, so we've got isotope trash here. So we're pushing that quite hard. And yeah, really this sound is all about this filter here. Well, I've set it to raw, pushed the resonance up, and I've automated it downwards. So we've got, as it's sweeping through the frequencies, you can really hear it sort of overdriving and saturating and creating some sort of angry harmonics. Okay, so next in line we've got Ableton's Overdrive, which I use a hell of a lot, and yeah, that's giving it some more bite up at like 1K, quite a wide Q at 3. There's our stutter, and again we've had to calculate our latency here, keep it nice and tight. At this point I felt there was quite a lot of weight missing from the sound because we've obviously scooped out a lot of that with the filter. So I used R-Bass to kind of try and generate some low-end harmonics. Yeah, it's quite subtle, but they're there, and they're kind of happening around 196. And then finishing off, roll off the tops, roll off the lows, little boost at 6K for a bit more presence. And then, yeah, exactly the same sidechain treatment that I gave the main horn, which is 2 instances of track spacer, sidechain to the kick and the snare. And we've got the wipeout ARP kind of ticking away there. Yeah, if we look at what's going on there. So I wanted to create like a bit more of an interesting groove for when this sound was used again on the drop rather than just using as it was in the intro. So we've got 2 Telephotos affecting the sounds. We've got one which is quite a dramatic change to the groove. And then a second one which is just like a clean ramp up to kind of create more of a kind of pumping vibe. I sidechained this sound quite heavily because I really wanted that big horn sound to be right up at the front of the mix, like it was the biggest thing you'd heard. So it's one of the main challenges of this mix actually, was to get that sound really big. And the key to getting sounds to sound big is essentially the absence of other sounds in the mix. So on the drop, it's barely there. You still get a little bit of that fizz on top, which is what I like about Track Spacer. You can still keep a little bit of those sounds there without ducking the whole thing. So then what you got is like a really like nice sort of natural sound crossfade from the two sounds.
Then man made.
These drums are kind of like fairly stock Metrik kicks and snares. I mean, that's the Hacker's kick, but I've done a bit of work to it. So I've boosted the areas here at 542, 107 and 57. And I've used this on it, the neutron transient shaper, to control the click or the transient. So if I take it off, there's a little bit of like a ring out on the top end of that kick, and I wanted to just bring that in a bit. You can hear it's just slightly kind of tighter and cleaner. The absence of that ring out might be a bit more noticeable if the rest of the drum track was more minimal, like Hackers, for example. But because there were lots of other kind of percussions and shakers going on this drum track, I felt like I needed to keep everything quite tight and clean, because things start to sound quite messy quite quickly. Moving into the snare, we've got yeah, again, it's the Hacker's snare. I mean, you know, I'm not going to win any awards for sort of originality here, but you don't have to rewrite the rule book every time you sit down and make a tune. There are ways to use your existing sound libraries to maintain like a distinctive and cohesive sound throughout your productions, but to augment them and to sort of mix them in ways that make them sound fresh from tune to tune. And that's kind of what I like to do, because, you know, there's lots of work involved in making these individual hits, and it's just not a very inspiring thing to do every time you make a song. So I've done quite a dramatic fade on the snare here, because I actually layered some organic breaks on top of this kick and snare to kind of fill it out and give it a bit more of a unique flavour. Again, I've used the DS10 drum shaper here to boost a bit of the attack and pull in some of the sustain. Moving next into hats, again, Hacker's hat. And then this is where we're starting to breathe a bit of unique character into these stock drum sounds. So I've laid it with this break here. I kind of wanted to get a kind of chub rub flavour to this Ed Rush and Optical. We've brought back in this techno perk from the intro. But I've actually tightened that up some more by putting this envelope here with Eliphoto on the 16th, and then ducking it to the first kick and the two snares, because we don't want those spiky transients in the sides conflicting with our nice clean snare drum samples. So yeah, going into top. Again, these are the mad shakers from the intro. And overheads, nice and clean. And all we're doing here is we're just boosting the tops a little bit, taking out the low end and ducking to the kick and the snare. In addition to that, we've got the techno percussion. So I wanted to sidechain them to the kick and the snare because, you know, there's some reverb going on there, and I kind of want that space to sort of pump against the kick and snare a little bit. Yeah, there you have it. There's the drums.
Then man made.
In techno is this idea of a lock groove, and it's kind of addictive, and that's kind of where I wanted to go with this. So we've got like so I created this patch on Serum, and you'll notice that the sub and the mid bass are essentially one waveform. And the reason why I did this is because you could take a clean sine sub and then layer it with like a mid-range bass, and you could low cut the mid-range bass, but then what will end up happening is you'll get some kind of phase issues from the EQ and its relation to the sub. I think that's fine if you're kind of like using quite distorted mid-range basses and you're making them quite wide, or you're throwing in lots of overdrive and stuff. But if you're going for a very simple sawtooth groove like this, like a filtered sawtooth, then I actually just use just one oscillator, like one wave, and that takes care of the fundamental sub, and then the harmonics as they send up the spectrum, and then literally just one filter to kind of create the movement. You achieve hopefully a sort of good phase polarity and deliver maximum weight from your low frequencies. I started off originally with a sawtooth, and essentially I kind of like work backwards from that. So there were some frequencies that I wasn't feeling that much, so I wanted to have more kind of emphasis on the bass, for example, and I'm kind of like maybe bringing these down a little bit. So you get the idea. You can kind of EQ it, scoop out some of the harmonics that you don't like. Anyway, that was the practice behind creating that waveform. And then I sort of arrived at a place that I was kind of happy with. I think I scooped out a few of the harmonics here to make room for some other sounds like the kick and the snare as well. Now you really want to be listening to that like alongside the kick and the snare as well. Like, what are the fundamentals of the kick and snare doing in relation to that bass, Like, does the overall picture, does the overall feel of that feel heavy? Does it feel like it has high impact, high energy? Does it feel too bloated? You need to be asking yourself all of these questions. Like, imagine it coming out of like a huge festival sound system. Is it going to sound epic, or is that bass just not quite going to cut through? Is it going to dominate the kick and snare? Those are those sort of like little micro decisions that you're making when you're tweaking all of these settings to achieve a well executed mixdown. The LFO1 is controlling the cutoff and the filter here, opening up slightly towards the end. Got a bit of bite here on the transient, like on we've got the portamento switched on here, so we're gliding up it in between notes. So it's another little trick you sometimes whack on the arpeggiator, and then you can it's really easy to jam, just like one finger bass line, Nothing going on in the effects we're keeping. Remember, this is just a sawtooth, and sometimes a sawtooth is enough, There's enough harmonics there to keep you happy. And then I've just like introduced a bit of bite onto the transient of the note, each individual note, by assigning LFO2 to the coarse pitch. Give a bit of bite, that's what I would do normally with a sub. But the beauty of this is, by not having two separate layers, you don't have to mirror the same changes you have on the second instance of it. Everything is done from one patch. The side chaining on the sub bass sound, we've got everything completely cutting out when the kick drum comes in. Bit more of a softer fade on the snare drum. Again, I've pulled back that curve just before the snare hits, so we're getting rid of any potential pops or clicks again before the kick drums. So that kind of sounded nice and clean and quite pumpy with the kick and snare, so I was happy with the level I set that at. There's a couple of other little touches. This sounds, it's kind of like psytrancey in a way, which was me just like auditioning like a bunch of stuff like on loop from again, I think it was TRK1. So just left it on record, auditioned a bunch of stuff, and then chopped it up, and that leads us into the B section where we bring the art back in, and not a lot is significantly changing that we haven't already done earlier in the track. So if you look at a lot of these automations, they're essentially repeated, and there's no harm in sort of repetition. In fact, repetition is good in music. You need to create that kind of sense of familiarity from one section to the next. This part, when I dropped the ARP on top of this section of the track with the bass line underneath, I was like, yeah, okay, the track was really going somewhere. Bringing the techno pad back in. So the only other new element that's introduced to the track happens in the outro, and it's literally just this kind of very distorted, angry, like lead line, like super saw type thing. So I'll play that to you. Gone turbo with the distortion, and if you're looking for that really, really hot, overdriven distortion, then UAD Raw is great for that. And you know, I've got that on, like, I don't know what that is, it's like 3%. Yeah, so you really don't need much. Yeah, really like that plugin, it's great. And yeah, and again, just got Underwater on there. Let's wash it out, why not? So yeah, that brings Ex Machina to a close. Hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and yeah, more to come soon. Cheers.